Your medication is poisoned, Vincent Palmer, the black janitor, whispered very close to CEO Margaret Chen, his ears at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, holding the prescription bottle he had just prevented from rolling off the polished mahogany surface after accidentally knocking it over while emptying her office trash, a standard orange container labeled Synthroid 150 mg that had released a chemical odor the moment it opened. A distinctive bitter almond scent mixed with metallic undertones that shouldn't exist in legitimate thyroid medication and which Vince's forensic pharmacology training recognized instantly despite 7 years of pushing cleaning carts instead of conducting laboratory analysis. Margaret Chen looked up sharply from the financial reports she'd been reviewing, her expression transforming from mild irritation about interrupted concentration to controlled alarm as she processed what her evening janitor had just said about medication she'd been taking daily for 8 months under supervision of her personal physician. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the careful authority of someone who had learned to evaluate unexpected claims before dismissing them. Though her tone suggested she was already categorizing the janitor's statement as either misunderstanding or inappropriate concern that crossed professional boundaries between executive and service worker. At 52, Vincent Palmer possessed the kind of careful precision that characterized people whose professional expertise remained sharp, despite credentials being destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. His movements while cleaning were methodical and thorough. His observations of pharmaceutical operations throughout Meridian's offices were automatic and unavoidable, and his ability to detect chemical irregularities was impossible to suppress, even though acknowledging what he noticed typically created more problems than it solved for a convicted poisoner, whose license revocation 7 years ago had reduced him from forensic pharmacologist to minimum-wage custodial worker. "Miss Chen, I apologize for alarming you, but the medication in this bottle has been contaminated," Vince replied, setting the prescription container carefully on her desk while maintaining the respectful distance that service workers learned was essential when addressing executives whose time and attention were valuable commodities, not to be wasted on custodial observations. "I'm a former forensic pharmacologist, and when this bottle opened, I detected chemical compounds that shouldn't be present in thyroid medication, specifically what smells like an organoarsenic compound designed for gradual release." At 46, Margaret Chen possessed the kind of exhausted determination that characterized pharmaceutical CEOs who had spent recent months fighting mysterious illness while simultaneously managing billion-dollar company through crisis that required mental clarity her deteriorating health couldn't consistently provide. Her hypothyroidism diagnosis 8 months ago had seemed straightforward. But worsening symptoms despite increasing medication dosages had created medical puzzle that her doctors attributed to unusually aggressive disease progression requiring ever higher doses of Synthroid that paradoxically made her feel worse rather than better. "Mr. Palmer, I appreciate your concern, but I've been taking this prescription for 8 months under direct supervision of Dr. Olivia Reeves, one of the most respected endocrinologists in the region," Margaret said, her response both polite and dismissive, in the way that executives learn to acknowledge service workers' input while making clear that medical decisions were not subject to custodial opinions. "Are you suggesting that my physician has prescribed contaminated medication?" "Ma'am, I'm suggesting that someone with access to your medication supply has been systematically tampering with your prescriptions in ways that Dr. Reeves wouldn't detect through normal patient monitoring," Vince explained, recognizing that his next words would either establish credibility or permanently categorize him as delusional conspiracy theorist, whose cleaning duties did not include pharmaceutical commentary. "The symptoms you've been experiencing are not from hypothyroidism progression. They are from gradual arsenic poisoning, designed to mimic thyroid disease while causing cumulative organ damage that becomes irreversible once exposure reaches critical threshold. Margaret's hand, which had been reaching for the prescription bottle to return it to her desk drawer, froze midway as she processed the specificity of Vince's claim. This wasn't vague concern about medication quality, but rather precise accusation about sophisticated tampering that required pharmaceutical expertise to detect and execute. "That's an extraordinarily serious accusation," Margaret said slowly, her executive training taking over as she evaluated whether situation required immediate action or careful investigation. "What makes you qualified to detect arsenic poisoning from briefly smelling a prescription bottle?" "I was senior forensic pharmacologist at Riverside Medical Center until 2018, specializing in medication tampering and poisoning detection," Vince replied, knowing that his next revelation would either validate his warning or completely destroy his credibility. "My license was permanently revoked 7 years ago after I was accused of using this exact poisoning method, gradual release arsenic in prescription medication, to kill a patient. The charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, but my career was destroyed and I've been working custodial jobs ever since." The confession created exactly the credibility crisis Vince had anticipated. His expertise made his detection plausible, but his history made him seem like exactly the person who might perpetrate such poisoning rather than detect it. "You were accused of poisoning someone using the exact method you're claiming to detect in my medication?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying the skepticism that Vince had encountered countless times when his warnings were dismissed as projection from guilty conscience, rather than genuine concern from falsely accused expert. "Yes, ma'am, and the person who accused me was Christopher Vale, who is currently your CFO," Vince said, watching Margaret's expression shift from skepticism to something more complex, as he connected her current poisoning to the executive who sat in her leadership meetings and had access to her office, her schedule, and potentially her medication supply. "In 2018, I detected this same poisoning method being used on CEO Arthur Brennan at the hospital where I worked. I reported my findings to Christopher Vale, who was pharmaceutical liaison at the time. Vale buried my report and then accused me of being the poisoner, presenting evidence that made me look guilty while protecting the actual killer, who I believe was Vale himself." Margaret stood up from her desk, holding the prescription bottle at arm's length, as if proximity to potentially contaminated medication represented immediate threat, though her expression suggested she was still evaluating whether Vince's story represented genuine warning or elaborate delusion from someone whose past trauma had created obsessive conspiracy theories. "Mr. Palmer, these are extraordinary claims that would require extraordinary evidence," Margaret said, though her voice carried less dismissiveness than before, as she processed that her mysterious 8-month illness might have explanation beyond medical diagnoses that had failed to adequately improve her condition. "If what you're suggesting is true, how would I verify contamination without alerting whoever tampered with my medication?" "The fastest verification would be chemical analysis that I could perform if I still had laboratory access and licensing," Vince replied, recognizing that every mention of his expertise simultaneously established credibility and raised questions about why someone with pharmaceutical knowledge sufficient to detect poison wouldn't also have knowledge sufficient to administer it. "But since my license was revoked, I can't legally conduct analysis. Your best option is to have independent laboratory test the medication without informing anyone at Meridian about the testing, because if Vale is the poisoner, alerting him would give him opportunity to cover his tracks. Or I could simply take tonight's dose as prescribed and see if anything happens," Margaret said, her hand moving toward the prescription bottle in gesture that made Vince's heart rate accelerate as he recognized she was about to deliberately test his warning by consuming potentially lethal substance. "Miss Chen, please don't do that," Vince said urgently, his professional detachment evaporating as he watched executive preparing to poison herself to prove Janitor wrong. "If I'm correct about contamination, tonight's dose could trigger acute reaction that—" "Mr. Palmer, if your warnings are legitimate, taking one pill should produce detectable symptoms that would validate your concerns," Margaret interrupted, opening the prescription bottle with decisive movement that suggested she had made executive decision to test hypothesis through direct experimentation. "And if you're mistaken or delusional, I'll have wasted 5 minutes of my evening on unfounded paranoia. Either way, we'll know definitively whether your expertise is genuine or whether your past accusations have created an obsessive pattern of seeing poisoning conspiracies where none exist." Vince watched in horror as Margaret removed one tablet from the bottle, placed it on her tongue, and swallowed it with water from the bottle on her desk, her expression combining defiance and curiosity as she maintained eye contact with him while deliberately consuming substance he had just warned was contaminated with poison. "There," Margaret said after swallowing, setting the water bottle down with controlled precision. "If this medication is poisoned as you claim, I should experience immediate symptoms. When nothing happens, I expect you to leave my office and seek psychiatric help for whatever trauma from 2018 has created these paranoid—" Her words cut off abruptly as her breathing changed. Sharp intake followed by choking sound that wasn't panic, but rather physiological response to toxin that was causing immediate anaphylactic reaction. Because tonight his concentrated dose had exceeded threshold where gradual accumulation became acute crisis. Margaret's hands flew to her throat as she struggled to breathe, her eyes widening with terror as she realized the janitor's impossible warning had been accurate, and her skeptical test had just poisoned her with substance that was now constricting her airway and turning her lips blue from oxygen deprivation. "Ms. Chen, you're experiencing acute arsenic poisoning. I need to administer emergency chelation protocol immediately," Vince said, his voice shifting from custodial deference to medical authority as he moved toward his cleaning cart, where he'd been carrying emergency supplies for 7 years in case he ever encountered another poisoning he could actually prevent. What Margaret couldn't know as consciousness began fading from hypoxia was that security cameras were capturing every moment of what appeared to be custodial worker administering unknown substance to collapsing executive, creating video evidence that would look exactly like attempted murder by person with documented history of identical accusations rather than desperate rescue by falsely accused expert whose warnings had been tested through self-poisoning that his intervention was now reversing. Some warnings about immediate danger are tested through deliberate exposure that transforms skepticism into medical emergency. And saving people who poison themselves to prove you wrong creates evidence that looks exactly like the crime you were falsely accused of committing. Before we continue with this medical nightmare, I need you to understand something. If this story is gripping you, if you're feeling the horror of watching someone prove you wrong by poisoning themselves, if you understand what it means to save someone's life and have it look exactly like attempted murder, subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you stories about false accusations, pharmaceutical conspiracies, and the impossible position of being the only person who can detect a crime because you were framed for committing it. Hit that like button if you felt Vince's terror when Margaret swallowed that pill to prove him wrong. And comment below, what time is it where you're watching? What country or city are you from? Have you ever been falsely accused of something and then encountered the real perpetrator? Have you ever tried to help someone only to have it look like you were hurting them? Would you risk everything to save someone who will probably think you tried to kill them? The investigation that would force Vincent Palmer to choose between proving his innocence and saving Margaret Chen's life began at 11:47 p.m. in Meridian Pharmaceuticals' security office, 63 minutes after Vince had administered emergency chelation protocol using activated charcoal and sodium thiosulfate he'd been carrying in his cleaning supplies for 7 years, and 14 minutes after Detective Benjamin Cross had arrived to investigate what security footage appeared to show as clear attempted murder by custodial worker with documented history of identical accusations. Mr. Palmer, I need you to explain why security cameras show you giving Ms. Chen an unidentified substance from your cleaning cart, after which she immediately collapsed and stopped breathing, Detective Cross said, his voice carrying the controlled skepticism that characterized homicide investigators reviewing video evidence that seemed to provide clear documentation of crime in progress. At 52, Vince possessed the exhausted recognition that characterized people whose past false accusations made current legitimate actions appear guilty regardless of actual intent. The security footage showed exactly what Cross described, capturing Vince administering chelation protocol while Margaret convulsed, but not capturing the context that she had deliberately poisoned herself to prove him wrong, or that his intervention had saved her life rather than threatening it. Detective, Mrs. Chen's prescription medication has been contaminated with gradual-release arsenic compound, and when she consumed tonight's dose, it triggered acute poisoning that required immediate chelation therapy to prevent fatal respiratory arrest, Vince explained, using technical language that demonstrated expertise while simultaneously making him sound exactly like someone with pharmaceutical knowledge sufficient to commit the crime he was being accused of perpetrating. Mr. Palmer, Ms. Chen's personal physician, Dr. Olivia Reeves, is currently examining her and reports that preliminary blood analysis shows elevated arsenic levels consistent with acute poisoning, Cross replied, his acknowledgement that poisoning had occurred not exonerating Vince, but rather seeming to confirm that crime had been committed by person with pharmaceutical expertise necessary to execute sophisticated contamination. The question isn't whether Ms. Chen was poisoned. It's whether you poisoned her or saved her, and the security footage suggests the former rather than the latter. Detective, I'm a former forensic pharmacologist who was falsely accused of identical poisoning 7 years ago by Christopher Vale, who is currently CFO of this company, Vince said, recognizing that revealing his history would make him seem more suspicious rather than less, but hoping that pattern of Vale's accusations might create reasonable doubt about current charges. Vale framed me in 2018 when I detected his poisoning of another CEO, and he's now poisoning Ms. Chen using the same method while positioning me to take the blame, because my previous accusations make me perfect scapegoat. Mr. Palmer, you're claiming that CFO of major pharmaceutical company has been systematically poisoning the CEO, and that he framed you for similar crimes 7 years ago as part of elaborate conspiracy, Cross asked, his tone making clear that Vince's explanation sounded like paranoid delusion rather than credible defense. Detective, I'm claiming that Christopher Vale has been poisoning Margaret Chen for 8 months using contaminated thyroid medication, that I detected the poisoning tonight through chemical analysis that my forensic training made possible, and that when I tried to prevent her from taking tonight's dose, she consumed it deliberately to prove me wrong, requiring me to administer emergency treatment that your security cameras captured without context. Vince replied, his explanation both technically accurate and strategically disastrous, because every detail that proved his expertise also proved his capability for the crime. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen was experiencing her own crisis as she regained consciousness in Meridian's medical facility at 12:23 a.m., 76 minutes after the acute poisoning that had nearly killed her, and 3 minutes after Dr. Reeves had confirmed that her blood contained arsenic levels consistent with systematic long-term exposure rather than single acute dose. "Margaret, your blood work shows chronic arsenic poisoning at levels suggesting exposure over 6 to 8 months, Dr. Reeves explained, her voice carrying professional alarm about missing diagnosis that should have been detected through routine monitoring. The symptoms we attributed to worsening hypothyroidism were actually systematic toxic exposure that mimicked thyroid disease while causing cumulative organ damage. Olivia, the janitor, Vincent Palmer, he told me my medication was poisoned before I took tonight's dose," Margaret said, her voice weak from respiratory trauma, but her mind processing that Vince's warning had been accurate despite seeming impossible. "I didn't believe him, so I took the pill to prove him wrong. He saved my life by administering chelation therapy, but the security footage probably makes it look like he poisoned me." "Margaret, Vincent Palmer is currently being questioned by police about attempted murder charges," Dr. Reeves replied, her tone suggesting she believed Vince was perpetrator rather than savior. His pharmaceutical expertise and prior accusations of identical poisoning make him primary suspect, and security footage shows him administering unidentified substance immediately before your collapse. "But Olivia, if Palmer poisoned me, why would he warn me about it first?" Margaret asked, her question revealing logical inconsistency that medical emergency had prevented her from articulating earlier. "He specifically told me not to take the medication, and I deliberately consumed it to prove him wrong. That doesn't make sense as murder attempt. It makes sense as genuine warning that I stupidly ignored." The logic was both sound and insufficient. Vince's behavior was more consistent with concerned whistleblower than with poisoner, but his expertise and history made him plausible suspect regardless of behavioral inconsistencies that suggested innocence rather than guilt. As Margaret processed that the janitor who'd tried to save her was being investigated for attempting to kill her, Vince's son, Kenneth Palmer, arrived at police station at 1:14 a.m. after being contacted about his father's arrest. Not to support Vince, but to provide testimony about his father's history that Kenneth believed proved guilt rather than innocence. "Detective Cross, my father was accused of poisoning Arthur Brennan in 2018 using sophisticated pharmaceutical methods," Kenneth said at 1:19 a.m., his testimony damning despite being son of the accused. "He's maintained for 7 years that he was framed, but I've always believed he was guilty, and that lack of criminal conviction resulted from insufficient evidence rather than actual innocence." At 18, Kenneth Palmer possessed the kind of certainty that characterized children of accused parents who had chosen to believe accusations rather than defense, because maintaining relationship with accused parent required accepting explanations that seemed less plausible than guilt. He had been 11 when his father's license was revoked, old enough to understand accusations, but too young to evaluate evidence independently, and he had spent 7 formative years believing his father was poisoner whose claims of being framed were desperate lies rather than legitimate defense. "Kenneth, your father claims that Christopher Vale framed him in 2018 and is now poisoning Margaret Chen using identical methods," Cross said, testing whether son's testimony would support or contradict father's conspiracy theory. "My father has been obsessed with Christopher Vale for 7 years, claiming that Vale is serial poisoner who framed him to cover up murders," Kenneth replied, his characterization of Vince's claims as obsessive delusion rather than legitimate investigation, revealing how completely he had rejected his father's defense. "He carries chelation supplies in his cleaning cart because he's convinced he'll encounter another Vale poisoning. Tonight, he apparently manufactured exactly that scenario, either through genuine coincidence or through deliberately poisoning Ms. Chen to vindicate his conspiracy theories." The testimony from Vince's own son was devastatingly effective prosecution evidence. If even his child believed he was guilty, juries would struggle to maintain reasonable doubt about accusations that seemed supported by behavioral pattern spanning 7 years. Some moral choices require understanding that proving innocence when falsely accused requires demonstrating expertise that makes you seem more guilty, and that saving victims of crimes you were previously accused of committing creates evidence that looks exactly like recidivism rather than vindication. 6 days after Vincent Palmer had saved Margaret Chen's life, while security footage made him look like her attempted murderer, he found himself sitting across from his ex-wife Angela in a coffee shop in downtown Portland at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, preparing to ask for help from the woman who had divorced him 7 years ago because she had believed, and still believed, that he was guilty of the poisoning accusations that had destroyed their family and forced their son Kenneth to choose between parents whose competing narratives about his father's innocence couldn't both be true. "Angela, I need you to talk to Kenneth about what happened at Meridian Pharmaceuticals," Vince said, his voice carrying exhaustion from 6 days of police interrogation, legal proceedings, and media coverage that had resurrected every detail of the 2018 accusations, while characterizing his current situation as obvious recidivism rather than vindication of claims he'd been making for 7 years. At 50, Angela Palmer possessed the kind of careful distance that characterized ex-wives whose divorces had been motivated by inability to maintain relationships with spouses they believed were criminals. She had loved Vince completely, until Arthur Brennan's death in 2018 had initially believed his claims about being framed by Christopher Vale. But mounting circumstantial evidence and testimony from colleagues who described Vince's obsessive behavior had eventually convinced her that his conspiracy theories were delusions designed to avoid accepting responsibility for crime he'd committed. "Vince, Kenneth is 18 years old and doesn't need me to interpret what happened. He watched the security footage showing you administering unknown substance to a woman who immediately collapsed," Angela replied, her tone carrying the weary resignation of someone who had spent 7 years watching her ex-husband's accusations become more elaborate, despite never producing evidence that supported his version of events. "You've been carrying chelation supplies in your cleaning cart for 7 years, claiming you'd eventually encounter another Vale poisoning. Now you've apparently found exactly what you were looking for, which seems more like self-fulfilling prophecy than genuine detection. Angela, Margaret Chen's blood work confirmed chronic arsenic poisoning over 8 months, exactly matching the pattern I detected in Arthur Brennan's medication in 2018, Vince said, using technical evidence that should validate his expertise, but which Angela had learned to interpret as proof that guilty knowledge enabled accurate detection. "The only reason I could identify the contamination is because I spent 7 years studying the exact method Vale used to frame me, which means my obsession, as you call it, was actually preparation for detecting crime that everyone said didn't exist." "But Vince, that's exactly what makes you look guilty," Angela replied, with brutal honesty about perception that Vince's defense attorney had already warned would be devastating at trial. "You've spent 7 years obsessively researching this specific poisoning method, carrying supplies to treat it, and claiming that Christopher Vale was serial killer who framed you. Now you've detected this exact poisoning in medication belonging to CEO of company where Vale is CFO, and you administered treatment using supplies you've been carrying for years, specifically for this scenario. To everyone except you, that looks like you created the situation you've been predicting, rather than genuinely discovering it." The assessment was both technically accurate and morally devastating. Vince's preparation for detecting Vale's next poisoning made him look like perpetrator staging elaborate vindication, rather than victim finally proving his 7-year accusations had been legitimate. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen was experiencing her own crisis as board of directors at Meridian Pharmaceuticals had placed her on medical leave pending investigation into the poisoning, effectively removing her from CEO position during the exact period when Christopher Vale was positioning himself to execute the merger with Chinese pharmaceutical conglomerate that Margaret had been blocking for 18 months on grounds that deal undervalued Meridian's proprietary technology while creating regulatory complications that could expose company to foreign influence concerns. Margaret, the board feels that your medical situation creates liability concerns and management instability that require temporary leadership transition. Board Chairman Howard Fitzgerald explained during video conference from her home, where she was recovering under 24-hour medical supervision. Christopher Vale will assume interim CEO responsibilities until your health stabilizes and the investigation into your poisoning concludes. At 46, Margaret possessed hard-earned wisdom about corporate politics, recognizing that her poisoning had created exactly the leadership vacuum that Vale needed to execute merger she'd been preventing. With her on medical leave and Vale as interim CEO, board vote on merger would occur without her opposition, and Vale's financial incentives from deal would be secured before anyone could prove that her illness had resulted from his systematic poisoning rather than from medical condition. Howard, Christopher Vale is the person who poisoned me, Margaret said. Her accusation both direct and unsupported by evidence that board would find compelling, given that only witness was custodial worker with history of identical false accusations. Vincent Palmer detected the contamination and saved my life, but Vale has been systematically poisoning me for 8 months to remove my opposition to the Chinese merger that would net him $47 million in compensation. Margaret, those are serious accusations that require evidence beyond the testimony of Janitor, who was previously accused of identical poisoning, Fitzgerald replied, his dismissive tone revealing that board had already decided Vince was perpetrator, and Margaret's defense of him resulted from trauma bonding or Stockholm syndrome rather than from rational evaluation of evidence. The police investigation is focused on Palmer, not Vale, and your continued insistence that your CFO is attempting to murder you raises concerns about your judgment that support the board's decision to place you on medical leave. The corporate maneuvering was both legally sound and strategically designed to isolate Margaret from power, while Vale consolidated control, using her poisoning as justification for removing her from position where she could block merger or investigate his crimes. As Margaret faced removal from company she'd been leading while Vince confronted that saving her life had made him look guilty of attempting to end it, both were discovering that Christopher Vale's plan had been even more sophisticated than simple poisoning. He had created a situation where victim and rescuer would both be discredited while he assumed control of company and executed financial transaction that would net him tens of millions before anyone could prove conspiracy that looked exactly like paranoid delusion from traumatized janitor and medically compromised CEO. Ms. Chen, I need to show you something that my father has been documenting for 7 years, said Malcolm Freeman during visit to Margaret's home at 7:23 p.m., 6 days after the poisoning had made his father into primary suspect rather than heroic whistleblower. At 38, Malcolm Freeman possessed complicated relationship with father, whose obsessive documentation of Christopher Vale's activities had seemed like concerning fixation rather than legitimate investigation. Malcolm was attorney specializing in pharmaceutical litigation, and his professional expertise made him skeptical of conspiracy theories even when they came from parent whose forensic background suggested capability for accurate detection. Your father mentioned he's been tracking Vale since 2018, Margaret said. Recognizing that Vince's son arriving with documentation suggested that even family members who had doubted him might be reconsidering their assessments in light of evidence that her actual poisoning provided. My father has maintained detailed records of every pharmaceutical executive death over the past 7 years, cross-referencing them with Christopher Vale's career trajectory and financial transactions, Malcolm explained, spreading documents across Margaret's dining table that showed pattern invisible to individual investigators, but obvious when examined systematically. 3 CEOs have died from conditions that mimicked natural illness progression, but which occurred at moments when their deaths benefited Vale financially and professionally. The documentation was both comprehensive and circumstantial. Arthur Brennan in 2018 had died weeks before board vote that would have removed Vale from pharmaceutical liaison position. CEO Thomas Richardson in 2021 had died during merger negotiation, where his death triggered succession plan favorable to Vale's proposed deal structure. And now Margaret's poisoning had occurred exactly when her removal would enable merger that Vale had been orchestrating for 2 years. Malcolm, why didn't you present this documentation when your father was accused in 2018? Margaret asked, recognizing that systematic pattern evidence could have supported Vince's defense if family members had believed his accusations rather than characterizing them as obsessive delusions. Because in 2018, I thought my father's accusations were paranoid conspiracy theories created by someone who couldn't accept responsibility for medication error that had killed a patient, Malcolm replied with honest acknowledgement of his previous skepticism. I was 25 years old, just starting my legal career, and I couldn't reconcile the methodical forensic pharmacologist I'd grown up with against the obsessive conspiracy theorist who was claiming that respected pharmaceutical executive was serial killer. It was easier to believe my father was guilty than to accept that someone like Christopher Vale could commit multiple murders and frame my father to cover the first one. Some sacrifices require family members acknowledging that they chose to believe accusations rather than defense, because accepting parents' guilt seemed more plausible than accepting that systematic evil could operate through respected institutions, and that vindication sometimes comes too late to prevent years of family destruction caused by choosing comfort of simple explanations over complicated truth that required believing impossible conspiracies were real. 11 days after Vincent Palmer had been arrested for attempted murder of Margaret Chen, despite having saved her life, attorney Malcolm Freeman stood before Judge Patricia Morrison presenting motion to dismiss charges based on evidence that systematic poisoning predated Vince's employment at Meridian Pharmaceuticals by 6 months, and that security footage analysis revealed medication tampering had occurred through supply chain access that only CFO Christopher Vale possessed, rather than through custodial worker whose contact with CEO's prescription bottles had been limited to single accidental encounter. Your Honor, the prosecution's case relies entirely on security footage showing Mr. Palmer administering chelation therapy to Ms. Chen after she deliberately consumed poisoned medication to test his warnings, Malcolm argued, using language that reframed video evidence from documentation of crime to evidence of rescue operation that prosecution was deliberately misinterpreting. But toxicology reports confirm that Ms. Chen's arsenic exposure began at least 8 months ago, 6 months before Mr. Palmer was even employed at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, which means the systematic poisoning that nearly killed her was executed by someone with long-term access to her medication supply chain, not by a custodial worker who encountered her prescription bottle for the first time on the night he detected contamination. The legal argument was both technically sound and strategically insufficient. Proving that Vince hadn't committed systematic poisoning over 8 months didn't eliminate possibility that he had administered acute dose on the night captured by security cameras, creating legal scenario where he could be innocent of long-term conspiracy while still being guilty of immediate crime that video appeared to document. Mr. Freeman, even if we accept that someone else poisoned Ms. Chen over 8 months. How does that exonerate your client from administering substance that caused her immediate collapse? Judge Morrison asked, her question revealing the evidentiary challenge that Malcolm's defense needed to overcome. Your Honor, the substance that Mr. Palmer administered was activated charcoal and sodium thiosulfate, standard chelation therapy for arsenic poisoning that any emergency room would have administered under identical circumstances, Malcolm replied, presenting medical testimony from 3 toxicologists confirming that Vince's treatment protocol had been appropriate emergency response rather than poisoning attempt. Mr. Palmer's pharmaceutical expertise allowed him to detect contamination that Ms. Chen's personal physician had missed, and when she deliberately consumed the poison medication to test his warnings, his emergency intervention saved her life. The security footage shows medical rescue, not attempted murder. It died as legal proceedings continued, with Malcolm building systematic defense, while prosecutor argued that Vince's expertise and history made him uniquely capable perpetrator, regardless of timeline complications. Margaret Chen was conducting her own investigation into Christopher Vale's financial arrangements and discovering that merger with Chinese pharmaceutical conglomerate was even more problematic than she'd initially assessed. Malcolm, I've obtained Vale's personal financial records through discovery process, and his compensation from the Chinese merger includes $47 million in direct payments plus equity stake in joint venture that could be worth another $100 million over 5 years, Margaret reported during strategy session at her home. But there's also evidence of prior payments from Chinese entity totaling $8 million over the past 3 years, which suggests Vale has been receiving money from the buyers long before board-approved merger negotiations. The financial forensics revealed that Vale hadn't just been positioning merger for future benefit, but had been actively working as agent for Chinese interests while serving as CFO of American pharmaceutical company, creating national security implications that transformed case from simple attempted murder into corporate espionage with international ramifications. Ms. Chen, if Vale has been receiving payments from foreign entity while negotiating merger, that's potentially violation of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and could involve FBI counterintelligence division, Malcolm observed, recognizing that case was expanding beyond local attempted murder prosecution into federal investigation with implications for pharmaceutical industry security. But we need to connect those payments to your poisoning, which requires proving that Vale systematically contaminated your medication to remove your opposition to merger that benefited his Chinese partners. As their alliance strengthened through Malcolm's legal expertise, Margaret's corporate knowledge, and Vince's pharmaceutical analysis, they were joined by unexpected ally, Kenneth Palmer, who arrived at his half-brother Malcolm's office at 4:47 p.m., carrying evidence that would either vindicate or further incriminate the father he'd believed was guilty for 7 years. Malcolm, I've been going through Dad's documentation from 2018, and I found something that nobody investigated during original accusations, Kenneth said, his voice carrying emotion from 18-year-old who was reconsidering judgments he'd made at age 11 about parents' guilt or innocence. When Arthur Brennan died, there were 3 other executives at Riverside Medical who had access to his medications. Christopher Vale was pharmaceutical liaison, but there was also Dr. Rachel Monroe, who was consulting physician, and pharmacy director Frank Chen, who managed medication distribution. Dad's investigation focused on Vale, but hospital investigation only examined Dad and never looked at the other 3 people with equivalent access. At 18, Kenneth possessed emerging maturity that characterized young adults who were beginning to understand that childhood certainties about parental guilt might have been based on incomplete information and institutional bias that had needed scapegoat more than it had needed truth. Kenneth, "Why didn't you share this with me 7 years ago?" Malcolm asked, recognizing that evidence about uninvestigated suspects could have strengthened their father's defense if family members had believed his accusations rather than accepting hospital's determination that he was guilty party. "Because 7 years ago I was 11, and Mom told me Dad had made terrible mistakes that killed someone. And I believed her because accepting that Dad was guilty seemed less scary than accepting that hospitals could frame innocent people." Kenneth replied with honest acknowledgement of how childhood need for certainty had made him accept simple explanations rather than complicated truth. "I'm 18 now and pre-med at University of Oregon, and my pharmacology professor mentioned the Brennan case last week as example of medication tampering. When I said my dad was the pharmacist accused, my professor said the investigation was inadequate because it only examined one suspect despite multiple people having access. That made me go back and read Dad's original documentation, and I realized he'd been right about investigative failures, even if I'd been too young to understand that 7 years ago. The family reconciliation was both emotionally powerful and legally significant. Kenneth's testimony about inadequate investigation in 2018 could support argument that Vince had been scapegoated rather than legitimately suspected. And Malcolm's legal expertise combined with Margaret's corporate access could build case that Vale had executed multiple poisonings while systematically framing forensic pharmacologist whose expertise made him both capable of detecting crimes and vulnerable to accusations about perpetrating them. Over the following weeks, as Malcolm's defense team worked with FBI counterintelligence to investigate Vale's Chinese connections while building case that systematic poisoning had been executed to facilitate merger that benefited foreign interests, all participants understood that proving conspiracy required connecting Vale to medication tampering in ways that circumstantial financial evidence and Vince's pharmaceutical expertise couldn't accomplish without direct testimony from someone involved in Vale's operation. "We need someone inside Vale's conspiracy to testify," Margaret said during strategy session. "Financial records and timeline analysis prove motive and opportunity, but we need direct evidence of tampering, someone who saw Vale contaminate medications or who participated in supply chain manipulation. Ms. Chen, there's one person who might have that information," Vince said quietly, speaking publicly for first time about suspicion he'd been developing over 7 years of documentation. "Dr. Olivia Reeves has been your personal physician throughout 8 months of poisoning, prescribing increasing doses of thyroid medication that were actually delivering increasing amounts of arsenic. Either she's completely incompetent or she's been complicit in Vale's poisoning operation." The accusation was both logical and devastating. Dr. Reeves had been Margaret's trusted physician whose prescriptions had been delivery mechanism for Vale's poison, creating question about whether medical professional had been unknowing victim of supply chain tampering or active participant in systematic murder conspiracy. Some alliances require understanding that proving systematic conspiracy demands investigating everyone with access to crime's execution, including trusted professionals whose involvement seems impossible until financial incentives and relationship patterns reveal that complicity can hide behind credentials and professional respect that make certain suspects invisible to investigators who assume doctors wouldn't participate in poisoning their own patients. The confrontation that would either prove Christopher Vale's guilt or confirm Vincent Palmer's status as delusional conspiracy theorist reached its climax when FBI Special Agent Laura Hendricks obtained warrant to search Dr. Olivia Reeves's personal banking records and discovered $340,000 in payments from offshore account registered to pharmaceutical consulting firm that forensic accounting traced back to the same Chinese conglomerate that was funding Vale's merger compensation, revealing that Margaret Chen's trusted physician had been receiving payments that coincided exactly with the 8-month timeline of systematic poisoning. Dr. Reeves, these bank records show 8 separate deposits of approximately $40,000 each, beginning in March of last year, exactly when Ms. Chen's thyroid medication was first prescribed, Agent Hendricks said during interrogation at FBI field office in Portland, presenting financial evidence that transformed physician from potential witness into suspect, whose participation in poisoning conspiracy appeared documented through money trail she hadn't successfully concealed. Can you explain why you've been receiving substantial payments from entity connected to Christopher Vale, while treating patient who was being systematically poisoned through medications you prescribed? At 43, Dr. Olivia Reeves possessed the kind of careful composure that characterized medical professionals whose entire careers had been built on patient trust and professional ethics that made accusations of deliberate harm seem impossible despite financial evidence suggesting exactly that betrayal. Those payments were legitimate consulting fees for pharmaceutical research I was conducting on thyroid medication efficacy. Dr. Reeves replied, using explanation that sounded plausible until Agent Hendricks presented documentation showing that the supposed research project had never produced published findings, never been registered with institutional review boards, and had never involved actual patients beyond Margaret Chen, whose treatment had been delivering poison rather than conducting research. Dr. Reeves, forensic analysis of Ms. Chen's prescription bottles shows that medications dispensed under your authorization contained gradual-release arsenic compounds mixed with legitimate thyroid hormone. Hendricks continued, presenting laboratory evidence that connected prescriptions to contamination in ways that made Dr. Reeves's involvement appear systematic rather than accidental. We have testimony from Pharmacy Director Frank Chen indicating that you personally provided specially formulated medication for Ms. Chen, claiming it was customized compound for her specific condition. That customization was actually arsenic poisoning designed to kill her, while making her death appear to result from thyroid disease complications. The confrontation with direct evidence and cooperating witness testimony created crisis point, where Dr. Reeves faced choice between maintaining denial that would lead to murder charges or cooperating with investigation by providing testimony about Vale's role in conspiracy that she had participated in but perhaps hadn't fully controlled. Christopher Vale approached me 18 months ago with research opportunity that seemed legitimate, Dr. Reeves said, her confession emerging with carefully controlled emotion that suggested she was crafting narrative that minimized her culpability while providing prosecution with evidence they needed about Vale's systematic operation. He said pharmaceutical company wanted to test gradual-release medication delivery systems using private patients whose treatment could be carefully monitored. The payment seemed generous but not suspicious, given pharmaceutical research compensation standards. I didn't know the research compounds contained arsenic until Ms. Chen's acute poisoning was analyzed and revealed contamination. But Dr. Reeves, you continued prescribing increased dosages even as Ms. Chen's symptoms worsened, which suggests either gross medical negligence or deliberate poisoning. Hendricks pressed, using interrogation technique that made cooperation more attractive than maintaining claims of innocent participation in research that medical professionals should have recognized as suspicious. Vale told me that worsening symptoms were expected responses to treatment adjustment and that increasing dosages would eventually stabilize her condition. Dr. Reeves replied, Her explanation, both self-serving and potentially accurate description of how Vale had manipulated physician, whose trust in pharmaceutical executives' expertise had made her unwitting participant in murder conspiracy. I trusted his pharmaceutical knowledge and didn't independently verify the compound composition because he presented documentation that appeared to show proper research protocols and safety testing. Meanwhile, Christopher Vale was experiencing his own crisis as FBI investigation had frozen his assets, suspended the Chinese merger pending national security review, and placed him under 24-hour surveillance while building case that would either prove systematic poisoning conspiracy or collapse under scrutiny. That conspiracy theories typically couldn't survive when examined by investigators with subpoena power and forensic resources. Christopher, FBI has obtained your financial records showing payments to Dr. Reeves, communications with Chinese pharmaceutical interests, and supply chain documentation connecting you to medication tampering, said his attorney Philip Hawthorne during emergency consultation at Vale's Portland estate. Their building case for attempted murder, conspiracy, and violations of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that could result in life imprisonment if convicted. At 51, Christopher Vale possessed the kind of calculated confidence that characterized people who had committed multiple crimes over years without facing consequences, and who believed that institutional protection and professional reputation would continue shielding them from accountability even when evidence mounted against them. Philip, the FBI's case relies on testimony from Vincent Palmer, a discredited forensic pharmacologist who was accused of identical poisoning 7 years ago, and from Olivia Reeves, who administered the actual medications and has much stronger motive for poisoning than I do, Vale replied, using defense strategy that characterized Palmer as obsessed conspiracy theorist and Dr. Reeves as actual perpetrator who was deflecting blame onto pharmaceutical executive. Palmer has spent 7 years claiming I'm serial killer, and now he's manufactured exactly the scenario that validates his delusions. Reeves prescribed and administered contaminated medications while receiving suspicious payments. I'm CFO, whose only connection is Palmer's paranoid accusations. But Christopher, Palmer's accusations are being corroborated by financial forensics, timeline analysis, and testimony from multiple witnesses, including your pharmaceutical liaison at Riverside Medical, who confirms you had access to Arthur Brennan's medications in 2018, Hawthorne replied, presenting reality that Vale's defense was crumbling as systematic investigation connected evidence that had seemed merely circumstantial when examined individually. As Vale's legal situation deteriorated while Dr. Reeves provided detailed testimony about his recruitment of her participation and his provision of contaminated compounds disguised as research medications, Vincent Palmer was experiencing vindication that felt less triumphant than exhausted. 7 years of accusations, isolation, and family destruction were being reversed through evidence that proved his conspiracy theories had been accurate detective work rather than paranoid delusions. But vindication couldn't restore marriage that had ended, relationship with son that had been damaged, or career that had been destroyed through false accusations that had required 7 years to definitively disprove. "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't believe you," Kenneth said during visit to Vince's modest apartment, where custodial worker whose pharmaceutical expertise had saved lives was processing that his vindication had come too late to prevent most of damage that false accusations had created. "I was 11 when they accused you, and Mom convinced me you were guilty because accepting that seemed safer than believing hospitals could frame innocent people. I should have trusted you instead of trusting institutions." "Kenneth, you were a child making sense of adult situations that even adults struggled to understand," Vince replied. His forgiveness of son, who had doubted him, representing recognition that false accusations destroyed families by forcing impossible choices about whose version of reality to believe. I don't blame you for believing your mother or for accepting explanations that made your world feel more stable. I blame Christopher Vale for creating a situation where my family had to choose between believing I was murderer or believing that respected pharmaceutical executive was serial killer who framed me. Those were impossible choices, and you chose the option that seemed most plausible, given what you knew at 11. The family reconciliation was both healing and insufficient. Kenneth's belief in his father's innocence had returned, but 7 years of distance and mutual pain couldn't be erased through simple apology or acknowledgement that initial judgments had been wrong. 3 weeks after Dr. Reeves's testimony had provided prosecution with direct evidence of Vale's systematic poisoning operation, grand jury returned indictment charging Christopher Vale with 3 counts of first-degree murder, Arthur Brennan, Thomas Richardson, and conspiracy to murder Margaret Chen. Multiple counts of conspiracy, violations of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for accepting payments from foreign entities while facilitating merger against American pharmaceutical companies' interests, and obstruction of justice for framing Vincent Palmer to cover up 2018 murder. Mr. Vale, the evidence against you includes financial records, testimony from Dr. Reeves about your provision of contaminated medications, supply chain documentation showing your access to victims' prescriptions, and pattern analysis demonstrating that 3 CEO deaths over 7 years occurred at moments when those deaths benefited your financial and professional interests, Prosecutor Amanda Foster said during arraignment, where bail was denied based on flight risk and danger to community. You systematically poisoned 3 executives while framing forensic pharmacologist whose expertise made him capable of detecting your crimes and vulnerable to accusations about perpetrating them. Your sophisticated knowledge of pharmaceutical operations allowed you to execute murders that appeared to be natural deaths, while your manipulation of institutional trust allowed you to destroy career of the one person qualified to expose your methods. Some confrontations with systematic evil require understanding that proving conspiracy demands patience to gather evidence across years when individual crimes seem unconnected, and that vindication for falsely accused whistleblowers often comes too late to restore everything that accusations destroyed, but remains essential for preventing future victims and exposing that institutional respect can conceal calculated criminality. 26 months after Christopher Vale's conviction on all counts, resulting in 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole for murders of Arthur Brennan and Thomas Richardson, plus attempted murder of Margaret Chen, Vincent Palmer stood at press conference announcing the establishment of the Forensic Whistleblower Protection Foundation, funded by $15 million settlement from Meridian Pharmaceuticals for their institutional failures that had enabled Vale's poisoning conspiracy, and by Margaret Chen's personal donation of $8 million in recognition that Vince's destroyed career and 7 years of false accusations deserved compensation that no amount of money could adequately provide. The press conference was attended by representatives from pharmaceutical oversight organizations, medical ethics boards, and whistleblower advocacy groups, whose collective presence represented institutional acknowledgement that Vince's case revealed systematic failures in how accusations against forensic professionals were investigated when those professionals reported crimes by executives with power to weaponize credentials and reputation against accusers. Vincent Palmer lost his career, his family, and 7 years of his life because he detected pharmaceutical poisoning by executive who used institutional power to frame the whistleblower rather than face accountability for murder, said Margaret Chen, who had fully recovered from Vale's poisoning and had resumed CEO position at Meridian Pharmaceuticals with board support after Vale's conviction had vindicated her opposition to Chinese merger. The Forensic Whistleblower Protection Foundation will provide legal defense, financial support, and institutional advocacy for professionals whose expertise allows them to detect crimes, but whose detection makes them vulnerable to false accusations by perpetrators who understand that destroying accusers' credibility is more effective than defending against their accusations. At 54, Vincent Palmer possessed integrated identity that characterized people whose vindication had been both professional and personal. His forensic pharmacology license had been fully restored after review board determined that 2018 revocation had been based on false evidence and institutional bias. His relationship with Kenneth had been rebuilt through years of painful conversations about trust and belief, and his expertise had been recognized through consulting contracts with FBI and state pharmaceutical oversight agencies that valued his unique ability to detect medication tampering that most investigators wouldn't recognize. Mr. Palmer, how do you feel knowing that Christopher Vale is serving 3 life sentences for crimes he framed you for committing? Asked reporter during press conference Q&A that gave Vince platform to articulate lessons learned from 7 years of false accusations and ultimate vindication. I feel relieved that Vale can't hurt anyone else, but I also feel profound sadness about the time I lost and the family damage that his false accusations created. Vince replied, his honesty about emotional complexity preventing triumphalist narrative that vindication had erased suffering. My son spent 7 years believing I was murderer. My marriage ended because my wife couldn't maintain relationship with someone she thought had poisoned a patient. My career was destroyed at peak of my professional capabilities. Vale's conviction gives me justice, but it doesn't give me back those 7 years or repair all the relationships that his accusations shattered. The acknowledgement that vindication wasn't restoration resonated with whistleblower advocates whose experience showed that proving accusations true rarely compensated for everything that making accusations cost. Creating recognition that protection systems needed to prevent destruction rather than just offering compensation after careers and families had been irreparably damaged. Meanwhile, Margaret Chen was implementing systematic reforms at Meridian Pharmaceuticals designed to prevent future executives from using positions of power to execute crimes against company leadership or to weaponize institutional authority against whistleblowers whose detection of wrongdoing threatened profitable but criminal operations. We've implemented triple verification systems for all executive medications, independent pharmaceutical testing of all prescriptions before dispensing, and whistleblower protection protocols that provide immediate legal representation and financial support for employees who report suspected crimes regardless of accused parties' position within corporate hierarchy. Margaret announced during shareholders' meeting that addressed how Vale's conspiracy had operated undetected for years, despite multiple warning signs that institutional culture had been incentivized to ignore. Vincent Palmer saved my life by risking his credibility to warn me about poisoning that I initially dismissed because believing Janitor seemed less plausible than trusting CFO. We're changing corporate culture so that credibility comes from evidence rather than from hierarchy, and so that expertise is valued regardless of employment position. The corporate reforms represented recognition that Vale's conspiracy had succeeded, partly because institutional cultures valued executive authority over custodial observations, making it easy for CFO to frame Janitor because everyone assumed that pharmaceutical crime was more likely to be committed by worker with expertise than by executive with power. 3 years after Vince had whispered, "Your medication is poisoned," and saved Margaret's life while appearing to attempt murder, he stood in the community center that housed the Forensic Whistleblower Protection Foundation, watching Malcolm Freeman, His elder son, who had become Foundation's legal director, provide pro bono representation to pharmacist who had detected medication fraud at nursing home and was now facing retaliation from administrators who preferred destroying whistleblower to addressing systematic abuse. "What your case taught me," Malcolm said during his remarks at Foundation ceremony honoring whistleblowers who had suffered professional destruction for detecting crimes, is that the people with expertise to detect sophisticated crimes are also the people most vulnerable to false accusations when perpetrators understand that destroying accusers' credibility is more effective than defending against accusations. My father spent 7 years being dismissed as conspiracy theorist because his expertise made him both capable of detecting Vale's poisoning and plausible suspect for perpetrating it. We're working to change systems so that expertise is protected rather than weaponized. At 40, Malcolm possessed professional dedication that characterized attorneys whose family experiences with false accusations had transformed their careers from corporate practice to whistleblower advocacy that prioritized justice over profit. As Foundation ceremony continued with testimonials from forensic professionals who had detected crimes ranging from medication tampering to financial fraud to environmental violations and had faced retaliation ranging from license revocation to termination to criminal prosecution, all participants understood that Vince's vindication represented both individual justice and systematic lesson about how institutional power could be used to destroy truth-tellers when protecting truth-threatened, powerful interests. Dad, the Foundation has provided legal representation for 43 whistleblowers in its first 2 years, and we've won vindication in 31 cases while still litigating the others. Kenneth reported during family dinner at Vince's apartment that had become weekly tradition since his reconciliation with father he'd doubted for 7 years. Your case created model for how to fight back against false accusations when perpetrators use institutional power to weaponize expertise against experts. At 20, Kenneth possessed emerging maturity that characterized young adults whose childhood certainties about parental guilt had been replaced by adult understanding that institutional authority didn't guarantee truth, and that maintaining belief in wrongly accused family members required courage to challenge comfortable narratives that everyone else accepted. Kenneth, the Foundation's success comes from your brother Malcolm's legal expertise and from Ms. Chen's funding and advocacy, Vince replied, his humility about his role preventing him from accepting credit that properly belonged to allies whose support had made systematic change possible. I was just custodial worker who recognized poison because I'd been falsely accused of using it. Everyone else did the hard work of proving that recognition was legitimate rather than delusional. But Dad, without your 7 years of documentation about Vale's pattern, we wouldn't have had evidence to connect 3 murders across 7 years, Malcolm added, his recognition of father's obsessive record-keeping validating what everyone had dismissed as paranoid fixation. What everyone called your conspiracy theories were actually detective work that law enforcement should have been doing, but wasn't, because Vale's position made him seem above suspicion. Some families are rebuilt not through erasing past doubts, but through acknowledging that those doubts were reasonable responses to impossible situations where believing accused family members required rejecting institutional authority that most people trusted. And the strongest reconciliations emerge when family members can admit they were wrong while understanding why they reached wrong conclusions based on information available at the time. 4 years after security cameras had captured what appeared to be attempted murder but was actually life-saving intervention, Vince stood beside Margaret at pharmaceutical conference where they were presenting joint keynote about medication safety, whistleblower protection, and the importance of valuing expertise regardless of employment hierarchy or professional credentials that false accusations had destroyed. "What I learned from almost being murdered," Margaret said during presentation, "is that the janitor who saved my life had expertise that my physician, my board of directors, and I myself initially dismissed because we valued credentials and position over actual knowledge and accurate detection. Vincent Palmer was right about everything, that I was being poisoned, that Christopher Vale was the perpetrator, that Dr. Reeves was complicit, and that systematic conspiracy had operated for years while killing multiple executives. He was right about all of it, and we didn't believe him because his expertise came packaged in custodial uniform rather than executive title. Some redemption stories don't end with accusers admitting they were wrong, but rather with institutions acknowledging that truth can come from unexpected sources, and that protecting whistleblowers requires valuing accuracy over authority, evidence over hierarchy, and courage over comfort that makes challenging powerful perpetrators feel impossible until someone with nothing left to lose decides that truth matters more than the career and family that false accusations already destroyed. If this story devastated you, if you felt Vince's 7 years of being called a conspiracy theorist while being proven right, if you understood what it means to save someone's life and be accused of trying to end it, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button if you're thinking about how security footage can show salvation as murder, how expertise makes you both capable of detecting crimes and vulnerable to being accused of committing them. But most importantly, comment below and tell me, what did you think of this story? What time is it where you're watching? Where are you from? Have you ever been right about something but nobody believed you? Have you ever tried to warn someone about danger and been dismissed as paranoid? Have you ever had your expertise weaponized against you? And here's the question that haunts me. If you were on that jury watching security footage of Vincent giving Margaret something that made her collapse, knowing he'd been accused of identical poisoning 7 years ago, would you believe he saved her or tried to kill her? According to the National Whistleblower Center, approximately 70% of whistleblowers face retaliation, including termination, license revocation, or criminal investigation. Vincent's story is fiction, but the systematic pattern of destroying truth-tellers to protect powerful perpetrators is real, and it's happening right now in pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and corporations, where people with expertise to detect crimes are the first people accused when they report what they've found. If you're a whistleblower facing retaliation, organizations like the National Whistleblower Center and Government Accountability Project provide legal support. If you witness wrongdoing, document everything. Vincent's obsessive record-keeping for 7 years was what ultimately proved Vale's pattern. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that being right doesn't mean being believed, that saving lives can look like attempted murder, and that sometimes the people carrying cleaning carts possess more integrity than the people sitting in corner offices. Subscribe, like, comment, share. And remember, Vincent spent 7 years carrying chelation supplies in his cleaning cart, waiting for the moment when he could prove he'd been right all along. 7 years of being called delusional, 7 years of his own son believing he was a murderer, 7 years of pushing that cart and watching for poison nobody else could detect. That's not paranoia. That's dedication to truth, even when truth costs everything. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.